Hello, everyone. Back with lesson 24, lecture 2. We left off in the moment when Caesar is dead on the Ides of March, 44 BCE. Now, to understand what happens next, we need to familiarize ourselves with a chart that will be on our mind for a number of weeks from here out. So if you look at this, this is the Julio-Claudian family tree. Family tree should be obvious. Julio-Claudian implies that it is actually two families that we are talking about. The first one is the important one for us right now. This is Gaius Julius Caesar family, right? So Julius is the main family name. Gaius is a sort of first name, and Caesar is a special name that all people in this branch of the Julius family will bear. So we will see that there will be a bunch of Gaius Julius Caesars in this, right? A number of them. The important one for us is this one with the name in capitals and bold, who was the dictator on and off in the years 49 to 44 BCE. To understand this chart, we also need to understand the lines that come out of the names of individuals. So straight lines usually imply horizontally a marriage. So for example, Julius Caesar, the famous one, had a number of wives: 1, Cornelia Cinna; 2, Pompeia Sulla; 3, Calpurnia. And from the first marriage to Cornelia Cinna, he had a daughter who was called Julia, and Caesaris is the genitive form. So this actually means Julia of Caesar, which implies that she came from this branch of the family. This was, by the way, the Julia who was married to Pompey the Great and who died of childbirth, which led to partially the end of the close relationship of those two men. So we see that all these men down the line are called Gaius Julius Caesar. All the women, as we have discussed in the family, are called Julia. Julia, right? That's the female version of the name. And so we can see that Julius Caesar actually named his own daughter Julia, right? And he also had a sister, and they would have the same name, which can be very confusing when we read the sources. But an important aspect of this whole family tree that we should understand is that Julius Caesar did not have a legitimate son. And he had a legitimate daughter. However, she did not have any surviving offspring. So that means that he had another tool, though, for his family to inherit power, and that was adoption. And so we see, and we will see this a number of future times in the family, that members of this family also adopt individuals who they want to become part of the family, also to make a line more straight, or essentially claim someone as a son. And so this is a good point for us to think for a moment about how adoption functions in the Roman world. I think in America today, most individuals are adopted when they are children, and most people who participate in adoption do so because they want to expand their family and partially also want to have that experience of raising a child. In the ancient world, the goal of adoption is something rather different. It is still an expansion of the family, but often those adoptions are of adults. And we talked already in the past about how life expectancy was very different in the ancient world. And this is partially a tool to manage that. So if in a family there are not enough children and none survive to adulthood, it is a sort of tool to continue the family line, which is also partially based on the Roman obsession with sort of family traditions and having ancestors. And we know that when you get adopted into a family, you don't just simply inherit money and property, but you also inherit sort of this family tradition of being part of a line. We know that Romans kept in their homes images of their ancestors, going back way further than, usually I think maybe you can get a picture of great grandma in American homes these days, but they go back much further. And this sense of coming from a set of ancestors is a very powerful, symbolically significant aspect of a Roman family. So Julius Caesar did not have a son. He had a son, an illegitimate son from Cleopatra. However, because they were never married, that child did not sort of count in Roman terms. The child could not really inherit or be an heir to Julius Caesar without major scandal. And so when Julius Caesar was looking around in the years of his dictatorship for an heir, he actually went a different direction. So if you look at his name again on the chart, you can see that he had a sister, and that sister married a man called Marcus Attius Balbus. And if those two have a children, of course, the daughter would take the name, the son also would take the name of the father. A son would be called Attius, and the daughter is called Attia. And this daughter, Attia, married a man called Gaius Octavius. And then the two of them had children, a daughter who after her father was called Octavia, and a son who was called, and this is the bracketed name, Gaius Octavius. So this is how Julius Caesar and a young man, Gaius Octavius, were related, and it was this great nephew that he chose to have as his heir. And this will become very important because in the days right after Julius Caesar was killed, and to follow along these events, you might want to also use the handout for lesson 24, which is on the other side of this Julio-Claudian family tree. We see that right after, on the Ides of March, Julius Caesar was killed, his will was opened, and in that will, Gaius Octavius was mentioned. So this is this guy right here, his adoptive son. And one thing that's also worth noticing here, how Gaius Julius Caesar is the name that this young man, Gaius Octavius, will take on. So he will become Gaius Julius Caesar after the adoptive father, Octavianus, to maintain his sort of connection to his own family line. And Augustus will be a name he will take on in 27 BCE, and we don't have to worry about that yet. So he is listed as an heir, and at this moment in time, he is essentially a college-aged young man. And so many of the Roman senators in Rome essentially just let out a huge sigh of relief, because they don't consider him sort of a real threat to their own power. They were actually much more concerned about someone else who was also on this family tree, even though he was added later on, and that is Mark Antony, who was Caesar's sort of last fellow consul and right-hand man, companion in his battles and political ally. And so, in fact, if you look on the handout, we see that Cicero, who at this point is very much hoping that the Romans would not have another situation of a singular individual being as powerful as Caesar was, he in fact focuses on attacking Mark Antony. And this is sort of essentially recognizing that Octavian, as a young man who at this point is actually on a study abroad program in Greece, was not really considered a threat. Were they in for a surprise? Octavian returned to Italy and fought in 43 in the Battle of Mutina, in which actually the consuls were killed. And he then, from all the money that he inherited, essentially raised an army, marched onto Rome, and had himself declared consul. So that's a very intense level of political claim. Of course, it's not the first time somebody marched on Rome with an army, but nevertheless, he used violence to claim this power. And the outcome of his arrival in Rome and sort of his claim to power, and in fact, an outcome of the failed plot to get rid of Caesar and all his heirs and anybody else who might want to become as powerful as he was in the future, was an institution called the second and only legal triumvirate of 43 BCE. And you recall that we already had a previous triumvirate, which is again an alliance of three men. And that's why I would try and Vir, right? Vir is the man, tri is the three. But this one was actually enacted by a law listed on your handout as the Lex Titia. Lex means law. So by a special law enacted in this year, and you can see the coin issued here with the three heads on it. These three men, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, formed a special group of officials who were responsible, as your handout shows, for the constitution of the republic with consular power. Essentially, their job is to protect the republic, and they have consular power to do so. So who were these men? Mark Antony, as we have mentioned, was Caesar's fellow consul and ally. Octavian, who is Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus in his full name, was Caesar's grandnephew and heir, and he's the one we have been focusing on. And the third man was Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Lepidus is the name I would like you to remember, who was Caesar's military deputy in Rome and who also had the religious post of Pontifex Maximus at this time. Which he just took over after Caesar's death. The three of them formed this alliance, and what they had in mind is that they got money from the Senate to raise 40 legions, which is an incredibly large army, to pursue the assassins of Caesar. Now, this was an expensive proposition, and they needed money to pursue these fellow senators. And so they used a tool that has been used before by Sulla, which is the tool of proscriptions. And proscriptions are essentially kill lists of people who are now declared enemies of the state. This list, for example, included Cicero, who you recall just a year before attacked Mark Antony. And supposedly Mark Antony added his name to the list. And if your name appeared on the list, you were an enemy and you could be killed and your property would be confiscated. The person who helped find you and kill you would get part of that property as well. So this allowed then the three men to be able to generate the money and to essentially be able to go on a grand military campaign against Caesar's assassins. And in fact, in the year 42, if you look on the map now, right here in Philippi, we are here in what would be modern day Greece. In two battles, the triumvirs encountered Brutus and Cassius, who still had loyal soldiers with them. The first battle in early October at Philippi, we see two of the triumvirs, Octavian and Antony, facing off Brutus and Cassius. And we can also see that, in fact, in this battle, Antony was much more successful against Cassius, who lost and had to flee, versus Brutus was more successful against Octavian. Antony, of course, was an incredibly experienced soldier and military commander. Cassius committed suicide as the loss unfolded, but just a few weeks later, in the second battle at Philippi on October 23rd, Brutus's remaining armies, although they successfully pushed Octavian's troops into the marshy area, were however attacked from the side by Antony. And after this battle, Brutus also committed suicide. And so the two head figures of the conspiracy against Caesar to kill him were now essentially done for. And so the year 42, so not only these two battles, but the suicides of the leaders of the opposition. And in Rome, and if you can see this on the handout now, Caesar was deified, which means he was declared a god. And if you notice, there is a Latin word in this line. That Latin word is divus. And your mnemonic aid for that is divine. And what that implies, actually, the Romans had a slightly different word for a god. That would be deus in Latin. So this is a kind of god that Caesar gets declared. I think in light of what we have seen about Caesar's claim to being divine, this is definitely within the range of what might have been expected. But you can see what a scoop this was for Octavian, who now could claim that he was also the son of a kind of god in this period. So he had a lot that he got out of this. And so this is how then Octavian and Antony were able to take revenge on the assassins of Caesar. And the second triumvirate, the only legal triumvirate, was able to fulfill their goal of gaining back the control over the Senate and over much of the Mediterranean, although not completely yet. This is where we will pick up the story in lecture 3.